Hello. I am live. I had lunch as I sometimes do before starting this, so I'm having that slight allergic reaction because I like to eat my food spicy and very hot, um, like lots of peppers and jalapenos and stuff like that. Pardon me. Just a little, you can see. So I don't see anyone here yet, so I'm going to wait a little bit or a few seconds for people to start ticking on. I was a little late in setting up this event this week because it was a very rough week for me. So bear with me. That said, luckily, this is a topic that I teach. Hello, Cassandra. Luckily for me, this is a topic I teach, and so I have some sense of what it is I want to work on and talk about. And it's connected to, in part, what I was talking about last week, which was the first wave of the abolition movement, which I would argue few know or knew or know enough about, that it existed, that there were Europeans who were working to end slavery. It wasn't just Africans and African Americans or the enslaved themselves. But this first wave of the abolition movement was somewhat successful in that by 1804, every state north of the Mason-Dixon line, which is the border between Maryland and Pennsylvania, was moving towards some form of gradual abolition. And it's worth noting also when we talk about abolition that it's gradual abolition. Great, Cassandra. I'm glad you're here, even if you're multitasking. I'm going to just continue refreshing last week and then I'll start formally. So, that first wave of the abolition movement did attain some successes. New England cleared of, well, again, gradual abolition. And I think this is worth noting. Gradual abolition meant that there were still people living in the North, in states like New Jersey and Pennsylvania, even Connecticut, into the 1830s, some of them, who were still enslaved. And in fact, Sojourner Truth's story, for those of you who have heard of her, and if not, she's a prominent, fantastic, amazing abolitionist, feminist speaker. Part of how she got her freedom was because the man who had enslaved her in New York was going to have to free her, and so quickly tried to sell her south so he wouldn't have to free her in the 1820s, 1828, I believe. And so she was able to sue and get her freedom that way. But the point is, New York, they will point in the history books that the abolition date in New York was 1800, and yet 28 years later, Sojourner Truth, as she will call herself, was still enslaved in New York. So slavery dies very slowly, even in the North. But nonetheless, the abolition movement was successful. The first, the first abolition movement I covered last week, because it attained that. And for those who were enslaved in the Deep South, I'm sure the promise that their children could be free would have been most welcome. Hi, Jay. How are you? All right. So, with that sort of stalling recap, hello, Nicole. I'm going to start today's story discussion with the same old thing that I say every week. So, I know the three of you who have commented are regulars, so you have heard this dozens and dozens of times before, but I hope you appreciate exactly why I do it and the necessity to remind people that knowledge and information is not something to take on faith, that it can be tested, it can be examined, and that we can find truth. And one way to get closer to the truth is to consider the source. That doesn't mean we can automatically disbelieve something just because we dislike the source, but nonetheless, we should consider the source. I wouldn't go to a lawyer for a heart attack, for example, and I probably wouldn't want an architect representing me in my criminal defense trial. Hi, Michelle. So, how is it that I am talking about this material today? Well, pretty simply, I have a doctorate from Temple University in urban education, and I teach African American history at Rowan College of Burlington County, and I've also taught African American history at Pierce College as well. So I have some experience and education in this area. My undergraduate degree was in history and African American studies from Harvard, and I studied with some pretty just outstanding people, and it's my lucky charge, my blessing, if you will, to help pass on the things that they taught me to others so that they can spread it further, so that the cause of knowledge and understanding and, of course, acceptance and a greater, more inclusive picture of our country will be apparent to more people. So with that said, Gabriel's rebellion. Now, like I said, always consider the sources. First and foremost, this outstanding book by Douglas Egerton, called Gabriel's Rebellion, The Virginia Slave Conspiracies of 1800 and 1802, is the definitive source on the events I'm discussing. And so what it leaves to me is some interpretation. And of course, because things are magical, I was looking for pull quotes, and I found one that I'll read later, which is directly relevant to certain issues and discussions in our contemporary society. So first, let's set up Gabriel. Gabriel was an enslaved man living in Virginia. You will often find him referred to as Gabriel Prosser, or more often, Prosser's Gabriel, possessive. Prosser was the name of his enslaver, not his name. And so to call him Gabriel Prosser is to commit that cardinal offense, as Malcolm X said, of giving him his slaver's name. So, Prosser's Gabriel. He lived in a time, 1800, the 1790s in Virginia, where circumstances were very different than they would become later on. And in part, this is because of the strides and steps from the first wave abolitionist movement. So Gabriel was literate. He knew how to read and write, because that wasn't necessarily illegal in Virginia anymore because of changes from the Revolution. He was a blacksmith and held a trade, and he worked in Richmond, not under the constant supervision of his enslaver Prosser. So that's Gabriel. Educated, literate, skilled, enslaved. But why was Virginia different? Well, the abolitionist movement had changed people. It had changed hearts. It had changed minds. Many people who once themselves had been enslavers, like Benjamin Franklin, who once enslaved 5 people, even Benjamin Rush, who enslaved 1 person, had not only manumitted, meaning freed the people they had enslaved, but they had become outspoken opponents of slavery. And one of the things I like to mention is that when we look at the Constitutional Convention, there are several clauses and articles, the 3/5 Compromise, etc., that directly implicate slavery. But I use the word implicate precisely because the word slavery does not appear in the Constitution of the United States. And even though the 3/5 Compromise and others implicate slavery, they do not say slavery. And this is notable because the so-called Confederate States of America, the rebellious Southern territories during the Civil War, when they write their constitution, it specifically and repeatedly will use the word slavery and slaves and enslavement and Negroes. They make no bones about the fact that their country is a slave-owning republic, and that's the reason why they were committing treason. So why do I bring this up? Because the absence of the word slavery, although slavery is implicated throughout the document, implies that there were people who believed slavery would not be a permanent condition in the United States. And this might be in part because of the work of these abolitionists, of the things that they said, the things that they argued, the revolts. In fact, the historian Gary Nash calls the American Revolution the largest slave revolt in U.S. history because thousands of enslaved Africans and African Americans fought the American Revolution for the British against the American patriots. And they were fighting for their freedom, which makes them slave rebels. And so all of that together led to a lot of individuals believing slavery was going to go away. Pennsylvania and Massachusetts had made it illegal. Exactly, Jay. Once you know something is wrong, you put in coded language. Jay says that they're always using coded language. It's worth noting, with regards to this coded language, that the writers of the Constitution felt the need to code slavery. They didn't feel they could just say it out. They knew that slavery was incompatible with the revolution they have just fought. And this is important because, of course, again, going back to the Civil War, or I guess forward to the Civil War, those traitors, Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis and Nathan Bedford Forrest and Stonewall Jackson, all those people with statues, those traitors, they didn't feel a need to use coded language. They came straight out and said slavery, slaves, Negroes. They believed slavery was right. And that matters because somewhere along the line, Richard Henry Lee, Robert E. Lee's great-granduncle, I believe, who had thought slavery was a necessary evil and probably going to go away, had yielded up to Robert E. Lee, who proudly maintained a large plantation of enslaved people just outside the nation's capital. So in 80-something years, Virginians had changed and transformed and gone from people who said things like, well, slavery is a necessary evil and maybe we should get rid of it and maybe this and maybe that and kind of like wringing their hands over it, to we proudly embrace slavery, we name slavery, we commit treason against our nation on behalf of slavery. And part of that story has to do with the topic of today, Gabriel's rebellion. So after the American Revolution, we are akin to a story, or our nation is akin to kind of a troubled, messed up, kind of fractious brotherhood. And in fact, there's a famous history book by Joseph Ellis called Founding Brothers. And so those founders, the ones whose names we do know, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, they are fighting with each other over the nature of this brand new country. Unlike today, they believed that they needed to do new things to adapt to new times, not just cling to old traditions and habits simply because they're old traditions and habits. Because, of course, the oldest tradition and habit had been a king, and they had kicked him the heck out of the country. So, yes, moving forward. And the first presidency under George Washington tilted towards a perspective of government called federalism, in which a strong central government had control and people's ability to influence that government was sharply limited. In fact, the only people guaranteed the right to vote under the U.S. Constitution were male property owners 21 years of age. And I mentioned last week that for northern states, many northern states, that included African American property owners as voters in the 1790s. And that's important because it means that, at least in the House of Representatives, where there's a popular vote, and in state assemblies and among governors, there are black men voting. And so if we wonder why they might have been more responsive to the needs of African Americans had more political power in 1790 than they would have, let's just face it, in 1890, by virtue of their property, their freedom, their service in the Revolution, etc. So Virginia's kind of working their way out. But there's huge conflicts between the Federalist perspective, Hamilton's, which saw the nation's future as manufacturing and trade and commerce and economic development, and Thomas Jefferson's people, who saw this agrarian landowning society. What turns Thomas Jefferson is he witnesses the French Revolution, and this is where it all gets screwy. He witnesses the French Revolution, the beginning of it, and he is inspired by people power in the streets of Paris. They tear down the prison, they free the prisoners at the Bastille, and also seize all the guns, barricade the streets, and they overthrow their king, just like the Americans had. In fact, they were in part inspired by us, and they did better than us, and then they did worse than us. Well, by 1791, 2 years after the French Revolution and into the third year of Washington's presidency, the French Revolution has spread to the French colonies, Saint-Domingue, Haiti. And so the Haitian Revolution has broken out, inspired by the same ideals which inspired the French Revolution, which was inspired by the ideals stated in the American Revolution. Jefferson is back in America, believing that Washington and his people and Hamilton are becoming too aristocratic, too much like the old British royalty, and he's concerned. It is also worth noting that the year the Haitian Revolution breaks out is the year that Benjamin Franklin and the Pennsylvania Abolition Society send a petition to the U.S. Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, for the abolition of slavery. Right? This kind of pushing, still pushing, the abolitionist movement is pushing, and it has powerful friends. But things start to go awry. Because, of course, Thomas Jefferson gets a little queasy. It is one thing for Thomas Jefferson to look upon the white French people, the peasants of Paris, revolting, and be inspired by it. But to see the enslaved Africans in Saint-Domingue, who look a great deal like the people that Jefferson himself was enslaving, was something altogether different. And Jefferson becomes very wary and skeptical of the Haitian Revolution. He eventually loses his battles with Hamilton. He goes home. John Adams gets elected president, and John Adams almost gets us into a declared war with France. We get involved with the French Revolution. And the French Revolution is evolving during that decade. And one of the things the French revolutionary government did was abolish slavery throughout their empire. And so what does this mean? What this means is that as enslaved Americans, still hearing and thinking about freedom and the promise of freedom for the American Revolution, hear that that other revolution had led to an end of slavery, are obviously continuing to hope and to believe. And people like Gabriel, who are literate, and he was not alone. Many enslaved Africans and African Americans are literate, are able to read the news. They know what's happening. They know what people are saying. They know also that the French revolutionary government is interfering in American politics. I'm not kidding. And so there's this fight between President John Adams, and Vice President Thomas Jefferson, between Adams' more centralized approach to government and Jefferson's more decentralized approach to government also becomes a struggle between Adams' kind of fear of chaotic revolution from the French Revolution, Jefferson embracing the French Revolution, but Jefferson not embracing the Haitian Revolution, but John Adams, well, not actively opposing the Haitian Revolution. So you have these fault lines in American politics. And so it's in this world that Gabriel begins to believe in the promise of freedom for enslaved Virginians and maybe throughout the rest of the southern states. So, as a literate blacksmith, Gabriel interacts with a lot of the enslaved community in Virginia and also the free black community of Virginia, which was still growing after the Revolution. Abolitionists had caused, dare I call it a revolution, in the minds of some Virginian slave owners, slave keepers. And these individuals had begun freeing the people they had enslaved. And Virginia had actually, I mean, it's the secret. It's the what you don't hear about. They had changed their laws to make it easier to free people. And so Gabriel's talking and he's seeing steps forward towards freedom in Virginia. He knows that in the 1790s, the rest of the New England states are abolishing gradually, but are abolishing slavery. He knows this new state of Vermont comes in, an entirely free state. He knows that this territory north of the Ohio River called Ohio is free. There is no slavery there. And so he believes that slavery in Virginia just needs a push. And, well, sorry, not slavery in Virginia. Abolition in Virginia just needs a push. And he wants to give that push. And so what is his thought process? Well, his thought process is this. The government in Virginia is controlled by Hamilton's Federalists. And Thomas Jefferson's people, the self-proclaimed Republicans, are waging a campaign against them. In fact, Thomas Jefferson hired a journalist named James Callender, who would later break the Sally Hemings story. But Jefferson hired Callender to write stories against Adams, and John Adams was so angry at the press, negative press coverage, I know, stories, the more things change, the more they stay the same, that he passed laws, the Sedition Acts, that made it illegal to write seditious stories about the government. And so Jefferson's journalist, James Callender, was arrested and thrown in jail. Adams also passed the Aliens Act, which allowed, did I say Jefferson? Adams, which allowed the U.S. government to just deport people that it considered or that it declared to be threats to America. This was aimed at the French government or French agents interfering in politics. And so Jefferson's people used these two acts, the Alien and Sedition Acts, as proof that John Adams and Alexander Hamilton and their party, with a lowercase p, they weren't a formal party, but their club, their friends, were moving to impose a tyranny on the United States. John Adams is a deeply unpopular president as a consequence, and Jefferson keeps whipping up a frenzy against John Adams and his administration. Gabriel sees and hears and says, aha, we have a plan. We definitely have a plan that we can work out. So I'm looking down at the book, see if this is my pull quote yet. No, not yet. Okay. So this is Gabriel's plan. Gabriel planned a revolt which would follow after a previous revolt in 1787, so some 12, 13 years earlier in Massachusetts, called Shays' Rebellion. And all the enslaved and free Africans of Richmond would rise up one night and grab weapons wherever they could find, and they would march on the capital from 3 different areas. They would seize the arsenal, which was also the prison. Just to really put this in perspective, the arsenal, where the government stored its weapons, was also the prison, which was exactly the situation that had existed in Paris with the Bastille. Gabriel, enslaved, literate, blacksmith, Gabriel is planning his own Bastille Day in Richmond. The connections are direct and deliberate. Gabriel believes that he is modeling his revolution after the French Revolution. And why does he pick the French Revolution instead of the Haitian Revolution, which he was also inspired by? Because Gabriel believed that he would have white allies. Lots of white allies. Because there were white allies. There were still outspoken white abolitionists. And he spoke specifically about Frenchmen being the Friends of Liberty, who were white, and Quakers being Friends of Liberty, who also were often white, although Paul Cuffey was a Quaker as well, and there were African and African-American Quakers at the time. Right? He believed that his movement would attract people, that its main issue might be the abolition of slavery, but that this was a broad revolution against an increasingly tyrannical federalist government, and that they would liberate the prisoners inside the Richmond jail, that Richmond Bastille, if you will. They would take the Virginia legislature hostage. They would take the Federalist governor of Virginia hostage. And this is where Gabriel hoped to break with the revolutionary tradition of Haiti and the revolutionary tradition of France. He did not plan to wheel out the guillotine and begin executing the Federalists. What he planned was that by holding the governor and the legislature hostage, he could force them to pass the laws abolishing slavery that would end the practice in Virginia. And because Virginia had been the place where the legal slave system had been created in America, his hope was that the changes, the end of slavery in Virginia, would ripple out and lead to the end of slavery throughout the entire American nation. So it's a bold plan, and it shows the inputs of a man who is not blindly lashing out in rage and anger. It is a man with a plan. It is the plan of an individual who was highly versed on world affairs, who knew what was happening throughout the world, who understood how other revolutions had occurred, understood how he could make his revolution kinder and more humane than what had happened in Saint-Domingue and what had happened in France, and hell, what had happened in the United States of America, where thousands and thousands of people died in our revolution. We tend to think of it as like, and then there was this, and then there was that. But we cannot forget there were thousands of lives lost. And not just the war wounded, the sick, the dying, the famines afterwards. I mean, thousands and thousands of people die for American freedom. But Gabriel thinks maybe I'll have to kill some guards, some militia, but then we'll seize the Capitol, we'll force the governor and the legislature to pass these laws, slavery's over, a new birth of freedom in America, starting in Richmond, Virginia, 1800, election year. Well, unfortunately for Gabriel, as happened with many slave conspiracies and plots, he was betrayed. What the problem was that he had spread word of his plot too broadly. It reached someone who freaked out, and the plot was betrayed. However, it was so close. The day Gabriel had originally planned his rebellion, there were massive storms in Richmond. Hi, Michelle. There were massive storms in Richmond, which caused him to postpone the day of the revolt. And it was that postponement which gave the traitor time to rat out the rebellion. So the governor, they round up the suspects, they arrest them, they put them all on trial for treason. And again, it's worth noting, these men, these rebels, or prospective rebels, they never actually got there, these conspirators were given trials. They weren't summarily executed. They were given a trial, or they were given trials. Unfortunately, as happens in these times, during the trials, some people plea bargain, betray others, so that they can save their own skin, and it turned into just a general sort of pointing fingers at this one and at that one. Dare we call it a witch hunt? In the end, some 27 people will be executed in Richmond's execution grounds and buried in unmarked graves, Gabriel among them. This happens in September, October. Well, not the executions or trials, sorry, the plot. But the trials, this is where things take an interesting and tricky turn, because they were still rounding up the plotters and keeping them in jail during the 1800 elections. And the 1800 election, or the election of 1800, is called the Revolution of 1800, because when the Electoral College meets, they deadlock. But after some maneuverings that are just going to put that to the side, I'll just shortcut it for you. Thomas Jefferson is elected president of the United States in 1800. His people, his supporters, sweep control of the House of Representatives. And they win control of state assemblies and state legislatures and state governorships throughout the United States. That's what makes it a revolution. It is a complete shift from the people called Federalists to the people called Republicans, or Democratic Republicans. There was no formal name, right? And after the election, but before the inauguration of Jefferson in March of 1801, there was a lot of fear in the United States. There were a lot of people who worried that Jefferson, inspired by French revolutionaries, would begin guillotining, or guillotine. Well, he'd begin executing Federalists the way the French revolutionaries had. And John Adams's people had stirred up these fears that Jefferson was a dangerous radical who was coming to kill people. And of course, this presented a problem for Jefferson during the interim period, or Jefferson's people, and the incoming governor of Virginia named James Monroe, friend of Jefferson, like personal friend of Jefferson, and later president, because his people were tied to the French Revolution. And Gabriel was inspired by the French Revolution. And so Monroe and the Jeffersonians specifically and repeatedly denounced Gabriel's rebellion and French interference and tried to prove and make sure that there was nothing French about Gabriel's plot. And this action, this activity, helped separate, because what basically happened was the Federalists, who were afraid of French revolutionaries, well, the politicians, they're all white. And of course, Jefferson and Monroe, they're also all white. And so they are trying to say, like, no, 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 don't worry, none of us white Republicans were part of this conspiracy. This was a Negro plot only. It was just Gabriel, and it was just enslaved and free Africans who caused trouble. There were reports that there were Frenchmen who had conspired with Gabriel, and Jefferson's people took great pains to suppress that information. We don't know if it's true. To this day, it's still kind of vague, but the idea that French agents might have been conspiring with Gabriel to overthrow the Federalist government of Virginia were very plausible to people at the time, whether true or not. And so, of course, in New England, newspapers reported it, and in Virginia, they suppressed it, and they declared the Virginia government, incoming government, that this was a Negro plot. It was only Africans, it was only African Americans. They were coming for the white people. They begin to really kind of harden that white-black line. And this is what I mean about, or what I meant when I said last week, that this first wave of the abolition movement comes to an end after Gabriel's rebellion, because in the 1790s there was still so much interracial cooperation. There was still white allyship, major white allyship. Benjamin Franklin and Benjamin Rush. I mean, Rush would be an ally the rest of his life, and he lived a long time. But there was prominent white allyship. But once Gabriel's conspiracy is betrayed, it is now up to the Jeffersonians to kind of try to take the focus away from the potential French involvement in this plot to turn it into a Negro plot, a plot of enslaved people and rebels, people who wanted to make this another Haiti. In other words, Gabriel specifically wanted to model his revolution after the French Revolution, but Thomas Jefferson specifically wanted people to think of it as the Haitian Revolution, in which the Haitian revolutionaries did take a very effective and bloody revenge on their tormentors. And that fear-mongering by Monroe and Jefferson had important consequences, because it made even non-slavers, enslavers, non-slave keepers, fearful of black revolution, fearful that Virginia would become Haiti. And this gives that incentive for those who didn't personally directly profit from the institution of slavery, an incentive to support those people who absolutely directly did. I mean, here's Egerton talking about Gabriel's idea. A movement called for the radical restructuring of the social order, which would hold a special appeal for those at the bottom of society. Gabriel wanted to launch a class revolution. And after it is betrayed, it was the desperate provenience of Jefferson's people to say, no, 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 no class revolution. This was a race revolution. So they're faced with a choice. And in the years that followed under Monroe, we would have a second plot by a guy named Sancho. Yes, Nicole, we did witness something similar last night during the debate to make a class issue and the exploitation of the poor seem like a race issue. The reality is that the revolutionary spirit dies very slowly. And Virginians, like here we go. I'm reading from Egerton again. More than a few white Americans north and south prayed that the conspiracies, Gabriel's and Sancho's, would shake the Virginians out of their complacency. Samuel White of Delaware, southern slave-owning state, speaking on the floor of Congress, called upon national government to strike at the horrid evil of slavery. So yes, as late as 1802, you have representatives in Congress from slave states who are denouncing slavery as evil and calling for its abolition in the halls of Congress. But of course, in Virginia, they recognized what it meant. And this was the key. It did shake them out of their complacency. And in fact, here's Charles Pettigrew. It is a pity. Slavery and tyranny must go together. What do I mean by that? Or what is the point? Well, the reality is this. Virginians of the time recognized and realized that slavery and freedom were incompatible. And in fact, slavery was only compatible with tyranny. And so what that meant was they faced two choices in 1802. Abolish slavery, as they could have done, or create a slavery so tyrannical, so controlling and dominating, that those who were enslaved would not have a minute's rest or even the time or capacity to learn or plot or think about freedom. That their lives must be lived under a constant shadow, constantly under the white gaze, so that none of these conspiracies could succeed. Jay says, if you are against slavery, then you are an enemy. This is exactly when that mentality begins to take hold in the imagination. And I mean this seriously, that even in the 1790s, people who kept Africans as slaves didn't see abolitionists as some sort of implacable enemy or crazy radicals. They said, look, we have a difference of opinion and slavery is wrong and we should probably eventually find a way out of it and blah, blah, blah. In other words, the kind of hardening of racist, prejudicial, oppressive attitudes in American life does not take place till after this time period in which I'm setting my story. And here is a very, very telling piece. In late 1802, this is reading Egerton directly, and I'll just point out, this book is from 1995, I think. So this book is about 25 years old. 1993. So this book is 27 years old, and Egerton says this. In late 1802, Monroe, Governor James Monroe, established the Public Guard of Richmond, a nighttime police force designed to protect public buildings and militia arsenals. The Guard also bore the responsibility of rounding up all bond persons after the town bell at 9, meaning enslaved people. Officers herded tardy slaves into pens near the market square, where, unless their owners promptly rescued them, they were stripped and beaten with as many stripes as the guard officer might see proper to inflict. At the dawn of the 19th century, so the early 1800s, few American cities employed police forces. They were especially rare in the impoverished South. But thanks to Gabriel, Richmond had one of the most efficient, if also one of the most brutal, forces in the country. In the same year, the Assembly cracked down on black sailors, by forbidding any Negro or mulatto, it's a quote, even if free, to obtain a pilot's license. Slaves found at the helm of vessels would receive 39 lashes because Sancho had been a pilot. So they begin restricting job opportunities for free and enslaved people. They begin restricting movement of free and of enslaved people. They establish a police force whose sole purpose is to enforce a 9 p.m. curfew by rounding up enslaved Africans, herding them into jail, and if their owners don't claim them, to then whip them. Virginia chose tyranny, and they established a police force to enforce tyranny. And the imposition of this tyranny was specifically designed to target African Americans. And the point was that people like Gabriel, highly educated, highly skilled artisans, could not be allowed to exist anymore. Other states will follow suit. We've heard of the Charleston Police Force, which was founded as slave catchers. But it was literally the freedom of movement is taken away. In Charleston, if a ship put into port and there were sailors on board, African or African American sailors, they were not allowed off the ship. And if they were off the ship, they were immediately thrown in jail, and they weren't released until the ship left port. So free people were arrested and jailed without crime or cause in Charleston because they worried about educated, skilled, free people. By restricting the pilot licenses, and pilots, of course, riverboat pilots, by restricting licenses, they hoped to de-skill the African American population. The existing pilots were allowed to continue working, but no more new pilots. So, just to flip it on its head, in the North, we had gradual emancipation of enslaved Africans. In the South, we had ever-increasing enslavement of African Americans. We would begin to see laws that the laws I've mentioned before that made it illegal to teach enslaved people how to read and write, to teach them skills, to let them move without passes, even during the day when the police weren't rounding them up. And then, of course, we will see the slave patrols and extreme violence inflicted upon enslaved people to kind of keep them in line, and also free people. So these events, Gabriel and the reactionary aftermath of them, by the people who styled themselves to be the Republican revolutionaries, Jefferson's party, spelt the end of the first wave of the abolitionist movement. And what I mean is that literally after 1804, there is no major state that abolishes slavery until the Civil War. So from 1804 until 1866, when the 13th Amendment is passed, there is no state government or the federal government, no government whatsoever, that takes action to free people who are enslaved. So it would be 62 years before government officials would move towards increasing freedom. And what that means is that when the second wave abolition movement emerges in the 1830s in the aftermath of Nat Turner's rebellion, a very different rebellion, it is literally a movement exclusively of activists trying to fight their way into positions of power, where some of them eventually would. Whereas the first wave of the abolition movement people of power already participated. And so when we consider kind of the challenges in our society today, ongoing systemic racism, violence, and opinions, it is definitely a false idea that this was inevitable, that this is just the way it always was, that this was perpetual, or even that people just didn't know any better back then. The evidence is clear. Even those who were enslavers in the 1790s knew better back then, that what they were doing was wrong. There were voices that made the arguments. And like I said last week when I talked about the first wave abolition movement, those first arguments are made in 1688 in Germantown, Philadelphia. And Benjamin Lay in Burlington City, Jersey, is holding activist protest against slavery. The voices, ideas, and arguments which articulated the fundamental injustice of slavery have been with us as Americans since more than 100 years, well, about 100 years, before there was an America. And that each step of the way, we saw incidents and events where people could have chosen a different direction, but instead they chose the path of creating a black-white racial line. They chose the path of maintaining slavery, making slavery worse, rather than working to abolish it. But we should also have hope, because, of course, that first wave abolition movement wasn't a failure. Slavery ends in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New England, Ohio, Illinois, Vermont. I mean, you get the idea, right? The story of the United States, as we often hear it in the 1830s and 40s, the story of admit a slave state, then a free state, then a slave state, then a free state. The fact that the U.S. government feels a need to balance out free states in the North and slave states in the South is a testament to the achievements of the first wave of the abolition movement. The fact that, though implicated in our Constitution, the word slavery does not appear there, is a consequence of the first wave of abolition. The first time the word slavery appears in the Constitution is in the 13th Amendment abolishing it. So we had movements, we had choices. We have had individuals who provided the moral leadership we needed. But we also have a long legacy of people who chose selfishness, who chose, in their own words, you can read them, who chose tyranny. These are the descendants of revolutionaries, the next generation, after the American Revolution, saying, well, if we want to do slavery, we have to do tyranny, and we're going to do tyranny. And so as we look forward, as we consider U.S. history, we should always hold with us this very real power that we have to choose. Just because we have chosen tyranny in the past doesn't mean we always choose tyranny. And just because others have chosen tyranny doesn't mean it's perpetual or forever. James Monroe's and Thomas Jefferson's Virginia in 1802 chose tyranny. But by 1866, sure, way too long, 3 generations. But 3 generations later, there was freedom. Virginians didn't choose it, though, but nonetheless, it was chosen for them. So just because people make the wrong choices doesn't mean we're stuck with their bad choices. Gabriel showed us that even in the darkest times, there can be people living in the worst circumstances with the talent, education, and courage to defy their society and to try to struggle for a better way. And even though Gabriel failed, others have succeeded. All right. If anyone has any questions for me, please ask them. As always, I'll throw up some links. But definitely this book, I'll show it once again, Gabriel's Rebellion, The Virginia Slave Conspiracies of 1800 and 1802 by Douglas Egerton, is an outstanding book. And like I said, it is 27 years old, and it says things that are very, very important. Yeah. I read this book in college, and it just blew my mind. Any questions? Jay commented, the same thing's happening when innocent people are put in jail for lots of years. Yeah. We have a flawed justice system. And in part, it's because we have a legacy justice system that was created specifically by people who said we're making tyranny. So as much as we can improve the system, and we should try to improve the system, we have to recognize the flaws inherent at the very beginning. You're very welcome, Nicole. So, if anyone else, or if anyone wants to ask any questions, please do. Otherwise, I'm going to call it an afternoon, and I will post up some links about Gabriel's Rebellion from local sources and reputable sources I've kind of gone through. And definitely feel free to check out this book, Gabriel's Rebellion, if you're interested in learning more about Gabriel and Sancho's conspiracies. And of course, the harsh Virginia reaction to them, and also the betrayal of ideals which they represented, Virginia's reaction. All right. I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to have a wonderful afternoon. You can always ask questions later, and I can always go back and check them. But have a wonderful afternoon and a wonderful day, and take heart. Nicole says, until we dismantle the criminal justice system and rebuild it, things won't change. There are a great many people who agree with you. I'm one of them. All right. Goodbye, my friends. Have the day. Please keep your hope. Please keep your hope. Gabriel was hopeful. There's always hope. Bye.